In this episode, we talk about why India has been struggling to meet its goal of eliminating TB by 2025. We also discuss India's plans to tweak its Olympic funding scheme in an effort to win more medals. But first, we talk about the ongoing tensions between India and Canada, along with the allegations against Home Minister Amit Shah. Hi, I'm Shashank Bhargava, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. For over a year now, tensions have continued to escalate between India and Canada. This began when Canada alleged that Indian government agents were behind the plot to assassinate Khalistan separatist Hardeep Singh Nijjar in Canada. These allegations were made last year in September and had sparked a major diplomatic firestorm between the two nations. However, in November, matters intensified when the United States alleged that there was an assassination plot to kill Gurpatwant Singh Pannun, another pro-Khalistan leader. When we spoke to the Indian Express's diplomatic affairs editor Shubhajit Roy, he told us that an Indian intelligence official and an Indian national, Nikhil Gupta, was said to be behind it.
And so a year later now, what happened was US once again filed another indictment in which they named that Indian intelligence official as someone called Vikas Yadav, who worked with the Indian intelligence agency, the RNDW, which is the Research and Analysis Wing. And shortly after these indictment came out last year, the Indian government now said that he's been removed from service. And there's a sort of probe committee was set up, which is cooperating with the United States. But India refused to cooperate with Canada, whereas Canada is insisting that it's part of the same plot. So the US plot against Pannun and the Canada assassination plot against Nijjar are the same single plot. It's part of the single plot, which India has been sort of rejecting those allegations that are leveled by Canada.
Now, since then, the US's Domestic Intelligence Service, the FBI, has put out an arrest warrant against Vikas Yadav, who is said to be in hiding. But the reason we are talking about these tensions now is because last week, Canada's National Security Advisor Natalie Drouin and Deputy Foreign Affairs Minister David Morrison told a parliamentary committee that Indian Home Minister Amit Shah was behind the campaign targeting Khalistani separatists in Canada. And this, if you can't already tell, is a very big deal.
In diplomatic sort of terms, when one government official, a senior government official, on the record officially to a parliamentary committee, names one of the top cabinet ministers, effectively the number 2 cabinet minister in Indian government, as being potentially involved in what is seen as offences and crimes and in the court of law, that is loosely called, it can be called the WMD, the weapon of mass destruction for diplomatic relations. And Indian government obviously has rejected. In fact, we had MEA, Ministry of External Affairs, held a briefing on Saturday where they said that, they have lodged a protest through diplomatic channels and call these references against the Union Home Minister as absurd and baseless.
In fact, the revelation that high Canadian officials deliberately leak unfounded insinuations to the international media as part of a conscious strategy to discredit India and influence other nations only confirms the view Government of India has long held about current Canadian government's political agenda and behavioral pattern. Such irresponsible actions will have serious consequences for bilateral ties. All along we have been...
And just to give you context, there was a report in the Washington Post which actually first reported about that Home Minister Amit Shah was behind the campaign of targeting Sikh separatists in Canada. So at the parliamentary committee, when Deputy Foreign Minister of Canada, David Morrison, was asked that whether, he had confirmed Shah's name to the Washington Post, which first reported the allegations, Morrison told the committee, and I quote, "The journalist called me and asked if it was that person. I confirmed it was that person." So He clearly sort of said this at the parliamentary committee, and that has, really riled the Indian government. And on Saturday, the MEA spokesperson clearly denied and said that a Canadian High Commission official was summoned on Friday and a diplomatic note was handed over in reference to the proceedings of the Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security. So you can see how strongly the Indian government has taken it up and responded to this particular allegation made by senior Canadian official in Ottawa.
Shubhajit, you mentioned David Morrison acknowledging that he leaked this information to the Washington Post. Did he say anything about why he chose to do this, why he chose to leak this information to an American daily?
Well, their position has been that, they wanted their side of the story to come out in the international media. And that's the reason they chose the Washington Post, where they confirmed Home Minister Amit Shah's name. And that's their sort of, official position so far.
And Shubhajit, is there a precedent to this? Is there any example we can think of in the recent past where an Indian government official and a politician has been accused this way?
It's hard to sort of draw equivalence to something like this. But, I'll give a recent example when between India and Pakistan in September 2018, when the India-Pakistan relations were still fraught and Imran Khan was the Prime Minister of Pakistan at that point of time. After a foreign minister level talks were called off in the sidelines of New York, he had targeted Prime Minister Modi indirectly, of course, without naming him, in a tweet. And that tweet was seen as very disparaging and derogatory against the Indian Prime Minister at that point of time. And once that tweet came out, at that point of time, I remember Indian diplomats sort of telling me that, this is like a moment where the relationship between the two leaders are completely ruptured, and that would have a complete negative impact on the bilateral relations. And it never recovered from that. And later on, we saw when the Pulwama terror attack took place, and then the Article 370 abrogation happened in Kashmir. So, it was downhill from there so that is the closest that I can think of where there was a spat and where a sitting Prime Minister is making disparaging remarks about the Indian Prime Minister. And that was the closest I can think of right now in recent years.
And Shubhajit, do we sense that these tensions will only be limited to the Justin Trudeau government? Or does New Delhi think that these tensions will continue even if, say, the Trudeau government is replaced after the Canadian elections take place next year?
That's a terrific question, Shashank. The thing is that the Indian government is hoping that, the Canadian elections are to be held next year, and the dates are not known yet, but it's widely expected that it will happen sometime around June next year. So that when there's a change in government, probably the new government, the new Prime Minister, the new leader, he would pick up the pieces and try to repair the damage and rebuild the relationship. But with Canadian Prime Minister's statements and now the Canadian officials naming top cabinet minister, it seems that it will have a really lasting damage, because now once government official and once the Prime Minister informs the Parliament and the parliamentary committees about involvement of Indian government officials and Indian government ministers, then it is very hard. It really shrinks the space and makes it difficult for a future Prime Minister, future government to walk back on. It's like a scorched earth policy. That's how one of the officials described it to me, that it's like a scorched earth policy where the current government, current establishment is making things harder for any future government to repair the damage. Also knowing this Indian government also knows fully well that similar allegations or even more damaging or more damning allegations are likely to come out in the next few weeks, months, as the judicial process moves forward in Canada. So there could be more stuff that is expected, that is in store. So that puts the India-Canada bilateral relations in a really sort of tough phase where there is the hope or expectation of a rebound or a repair looks like a remote possibility right now.
And Shubhajit, could you also talk a bit about how this would impact an average Indian citizen trying to visit Canada or who might be looking to study there?
Yeah, absolutely. It's already affecting Indians who want to travel to Canada for education, for jobs. Canada is one of the few countries which offers a permanent residency for Indians, and especially skilled Indians going overseas, going to Canada. And because of lack of manpower, lack of personnel, also this complete breakdown of trust and diplomatic relations, there is sort of a huge backlog of visa applications that is really hampering Indians. So that is the impact that is there on an average Indian who wants to travel there. Because as you know, there is like a huge diaspora, almost 8-9 lakh people of Indian origin, or either they're Indian citizens or they have become Canadian passport holders. They live and work in Canada, and their families, they want to visit here. Families from India want to visit them. There are a lot of people who want to go and work there. There are a lot of students. Canada is seen as one of the top destinations after US, UK, in amongst the Anglo-Saxon countries, English-speaking countries, as a future, as a favored, education destination. So all these students who want to go and study there, all these people who want to visit their families, all these people who want to just go and work there, or people who are just tourists, there's a whole backlog. And that is something that Indians are facing over the last 1 year or so.
And next we talk about tuberculosis. Last week, the World Health Organization released the latest global TB report, which highlighted that although India saw a slight decline in the estimated number of TB cases, it was nowhere near its goal of eliminating the disease by 2025. Now, before we go ahead and talk about the report a bit more, let's first understand what exactly tuberculosis is.
So, tuberculosis is a bacterial infection.
That's Indian Express's Anonna Dutt, who will be telling us about the report.
And it spreads through droplets and contact. So if you are living in the same household with someone with TB, you are likely to get it from their, sputum. And when they cough, the droplets that come out in the air, that can give you the infection.
And how big of a problem would you say TB is for India, and how does it compare to some of the other infectious diseases?
So tuberculosis is a big problem, not just for India, but for the world, because it continues to be a leading infectious killer. So, with good antibiotics and infection control practices, we have been able to bring down a lot of deaths that happen due to infections. But tuberculosis continues to spread, and it continues to affect a large number of people. In fact, India is the largest contributor of TB. So India accounts for 26% of the total global burden of TB. So it's a huge problem. Every year, around just over 3 lakh people die of tuberculosis in India. To compare, COVID-19 in total killed about just over 5 lakh people. So tuberculosis continues to be a major killer infection.
Right, and we are talking just after the release of the global TB report. Could you share some of its key highlights for India?
So if we talk about the number of cases and deaths, they remain more or less same, just, slightly lower than last year. India continues to contribute about, like I said, 26% of the global TB cases and 29% of the deaths in TB patients who do not have HIV. And then the other number that we saw in the report is the number of reported TB cases. So there are two things that are essential to look out for in the TB report. One is the estimated number and one is the actual reported number. This is because that tells you how much there is a gap in diagnosis and treatment of TB in a country. And India is closing that gap. There were 25.1 lakh infections that were reported in 2023, and there were about 28 lakh cases. So we missed about 3 lakh cases, but this gap used to be very wide, and we are slowly closing that down, which is a positive thing. Then another thing that the report told us was that the treatment coverage in India stood at 85%. That means 85% of the people who got diagnosed were put on treatment, which is again a good thing.
Yeah, and this is the good part of the report for India. But the biggest sort of revelation to come out of this report was regarding where India stands in terms of eliminating TB. So tell us what the report says about that.
So India has a target of eliminating TB by 2025, 5 years ahead of the global target. But when it comes to WHO's Stop TB initiative, it has some guidelines as to how much reduction countries need to achieve in terms of the number of cases and the number of deaths over the years. So their 2025 target, 50% reduction in the number of cases and 75% reduction in the number of deaths. With 2015 as the base year. And India was able to achieve only 18% reduction in the number of cases and 24% decrease in the number of deaths. So there is just 2 years to go and we are not close to the target. That was the biggest finding of the report.
Okay, so what are the challenges that India continues to face in meeting that target? And how would you say those challenges compare to the ones faced by other countries where TB continues to remain prevalent?
So there would be difference in strategies for tuberculosis in a country, say, where there are very few cases. But in India, TB continues to be a big problem. So currently the government focuses on testing, treating and, following up these cases so that they complete the treatment. Because the treatment for TB is not for a few days, it's for months. So even if you have susceptible TB, which is basically a TB that can be treated by any of the antibiotics, for that TB as well, you have to take about 6 months of medicines. And for the drug-resistant TB, you would be taking the drugs for around 2 years. And there are also side effects that you have to be worried about. So it's very important that people do continue taking the medicines, but it is also very difficult to motivate people to keep taking those medicines. So that is one challenge. Another thing that the government has now done is that they have introduced preventive treatment. So they give the medicines to household contacts of a TB patient. They also give it to people who live with HIV and who are much more susceptible to getting TB. Then the government is also looking at, whether BCG vaccination could help. There are newer versions of the BCG vaccines that are coming up, and the government is looking at whether that could help in reducing the burden. That is another thing. There are newer drug regimens that are being approved. So shorter courses of treatment with lesser side effects, more of oral treatment as compared to injectables. So these are things that we are doing. But one of the biggest challenges is undernutrition. And a lot of the TB that we have in India is related to undernutrition. So people who are undernourished are much more likely to have a weaker immune system and get TB and have more severe disease with TB. So that continues to be a challenge, and the government, apart from giving direct benefit transfer of rupees 500 to the patient for the duration of treatment, and they've also started another program called Nikshay Mitra, where people can adopt these patients and they can help them with the nutrition. So these are the steps that have been taken. Experts say these are the right steps, but yes, we have a long way to go.
And since you mentioned that the treatment goes on for a long time and the government is already doing direct benefit transfers, one assumes that the treatment is also costly?
So yes, the treatment can be costly because these are antibiotics and very potent ones. However, you can get all the medicines free of cost from the government centers. So the DOT centers provide all the medicines free of cost to all TB patients.
And could you also talk about the kind of things the government has done over time to spread awareness about this problem?
So, of course, from time to time, they reach out to people. They also do these active surveillance where they go to places and look for TB cases. They look for TB cases in households where one member already has the infection, and also give out the messages. The ASHA workers talk about the infection because it is one of the priority diseases for India. But we also see a lot of advertisements, ad campaigns that the government does to ensure that, people come and get treated. So, for example, there were Amitabh Bachchan advertisements where he tells people that, oh, if you've been coughing for more than 2 weeks, you should probably get a test for TB. Or, if you have TB, why did you stop your treatment midway? These have been campaigns that the government has been doing to motivate people to get tested and then continue with their treatment.
आधी दाढ़ी मंजूर नहीं, टीबी का आधा अधूरा इलाज मंजूर है आपको? हाँ? याद रखिए, टीबी का आधा अधूरा इलाज करवाइएगा तो टीबी आपको दोबारा हो सकता है। इसलिए टीबी से मुक्ति पाने के लिए टीबी का पूरा इलाज करवाइए, फुल कोर्स। इंडिया वर्सेस टीबी, टीबी हारेगा, देश जीतेगा।
And Mr. Bachchan has been participating in this campaign. He himself is a TB survivor. He had spinal tuberculosis and in fact thought that it was back pain, because of sitting on chairs for too long and things like that. So here I would like to mention about, non-pulmonary TB. So when we talk about TB, we mostly think of people coughing and having a chest infection. But tuberculosis can cause infections in other parts of the bodies as well, spine being a very common extrapulmonary TB. It can also happen in the abdomen. So these are places where the diagnosis doesn't happen too quickly because people do not think that it is TB. And when they see a mass, a lot of doctors also tend to think it could be cancerous. So that kind of delays, treatment for extrapulmonary TB. That's a challenge.
And in the end, we talk about the changes India is planning to make to its Olympic funding scheme. Over the years, India's performance at the Games has been consistently dismal. And since its inception, its medal tally has never reached double digits. And so now, after the recently concluded Paris Olympics, where India won only 6 medals, the government is planning to make some changes. The Indian Express's Mihir Vasavda and the co-host of the Express Sports podcast tells us more about it.
The first review report it's not an official report yet. These are all sources informing us of what's the discussion like right now within the government, because government is the major funder of India's Olympic program. And the first thing that the whole review is pointing at is looking at the funding model of the Olympics. If I were to explain it in a nutshell, the way Indian athletes are funded is you have broadly 3 schemes. The first is an assistance to all national sports federations, which takes care of the junior programs, of the national training camps, of athletes traveling abroad for competitions and so on and so forth. Then you've got CSR funding that's used in different ways by different organizations. And for the elite athletes of the country, there is this scheme called Target Olympic Podium Scheme. Now, earlier this year, just before the Olympics, we had kind of tried to understand how these athletes are funded under TOPS, the Target Olympic Podium Scheme. And we figured out that the tiniest of requirements, right? It could be horse feed, or it could be PV Sindhu needing 12 people in her entourage while training in Germany. So the entire spectrum of requirements are covered under the TOPS scheme. And now the government is looking at a proposal, at an idea where hundreds of athletes who were getting this benefit under TOPS, where they could customize their training programs, they'll now not have this unfettered access to public money. They'll be dropped from the scheme, primarily because the results do not match the kind of support that's been given.
Wait, so is that like the government thinking that, since we are not getting the bang for a buck, let us cut down on this scheme?
So it's not cutting down on money. There is a very clear-cut distinction here, but you're right in your first assessment. The scheme itself says Target Olympic Podium. And when we last checked, there are close to 300 athletes in the core group and the developmental group who receive funding under TOPS. Now, India, we know, do not have 300 medal potentials at the Olympics. The best case scenario would be 30, but I would be a lot stringent and stricter and say it would be around 15 to 20 athletes who are genuine medal potentials at the Olympics. So the thinking is to focus on them. I'm not saying they'll reduce it from 300 to 15 or 20. We don't know how the final proposal will look. And it's important again to underline that there is resistance from athletes and administrators against such a move because it directly impacts their preparations. But what we are being told is, say for example, if 300 athletes receive funding under TOPS right now, that number could be halved if this proposal goes through.
And Mihir, what do experts say about the kind of impact this is going to have? One, on the medal tally, because what they're saying is that, we are going to take this funding and only concentrate on a limited number of athletes who we really think are going to win. And second, what does it do to India's hopes for creating a larger pool of Olympic athletes?
So 2 questions here. I'll break down. The first answer, it's very difficult to kind of, directly have a correlation between the money spent and the medals won. That's a very tough thing to do. But even during the Olympics, Shashank, we saw a lot of experts questioning the funding pattern, right? So we saw the comments of the legendary badminton player Prakash Padukone, who, hinted that to some extent, the fact that the players were pampered affected their hunger to win. He said that the funding structure has to be rationalized, and there is some merit in that argument because if we compare what India spends compared to the other countries, then India does spend a lot more for an Olympic medal. There was this interesting piece in the British media, I remember reading it in the Daily Mail, where they calculated average cost of a medal won by Britain at the Paris Olympics, and it was approximately 41.2 crore. So how they did was just take into account their overall spending in this Olympic cycle and divide it by the total number of medals won. So that was 41.2 crores on average on each medal that Britain won. In comparison, India spent 78.3 crore per medal on an average. So India's athletes have far more funds at their disposal. The whole challenge now is to ensure it's spent wisely.
A lot of people would have assumed that India probably spends a lot less since our sports budget isn't that big. But what you're saying is that compared to Britain, we are spending about twice as much. That's a lot, right?
It's a lot. It's a lot spent per medal. It might be less than what perhaps China spends. We don't have the current figures of how much China spent per medal at the Paris Olympics. But in the last 10 years, what we've seen under the current government, like the Modi government, is through TOPS, which is their flagship funding scheme for athletes, elite athletes, almost all requirements, all the demands of athletes have been met, practically no questions asked. And this is more so true in the Paris Olympic cycle. From Tokyo 2021 to Paris, the 3 years, everything that they asked was given. So funding, I don't think, is a problem. What might happen now, or what those who are in the decision-making scheme of things, what they want to do is to ensure that not just the elite athletes or not just the 200, 250 athletes who go to the Olympics or in contention to go for the Olympics are funded. So India, of course, pays a lot of attention and importance to the Asian Games, for example. So the counter argument to this whole rationale of cutting down the athletes in the top scheme is how do you then support those who will be competing at the Asian Games? Asian Games is also, for some sports, an Olympic qualification tournament. So some athletes might not be good enough to win a medal at the Olympics, but they're still good enough to win a medal at the Asian Games and then qualify for the Olympics. So these are the tricky things. And then how do you continue funding the junior programs? So it's not as straightforward as, just cutting the number of athletes. There is a lot of discussion and debate going on over there.
And if not on individual athletes and their demands, what do experts say about how this money should be spent?
The developmental group of TOPS is actually where they feel a lot of money should be going because, these are the athletes. The juniors, for example, are the athletes who are on the lowest level of the pyramid. And we've seen through multiple studies of our own, with the stories that we've done, that those athletes, the promising juniors, have often to depend on jugards, to get their work done. So their journeys are like real life Super Mario challenges. They have to kind of navigate through multiple hurdles and, do things enterprising ways and reach their targets. So they must get a slice of the whole government funding pie. And that is where many feel that the focus should shift, because if we have to look at the long term, if India has to look at the long term, the 2032, the 2036 Olympics, which India is trying to host, it will be these juniors who will be in contention 12 years down the line. And also we must not forget that there is sporting infrastructure coming up everywhere in the country. Ahmedabad, Bhubaneswar, Telangana, you name a state and sporting infrastructure is being built there. And you'll need more and more athletes to perform in those arenas. So you will have to fund that program as well. So junior level funding is where there is a big gap, because the corporates aren't yet, totally warmed up to the idea of supporting Olympic athletes. This onus falls on the government.
You were listening to 3 Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was written and produced by me, Shashank Bhargava, and was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it. Share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can tweet us at Express Podcasts and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.